Thanks everyone for the first thanks to the organizer for organizing and inviting us. So this is, as you can see, there are many familiar names. It's a joint work with Javad, who's sitting there, and Nick, Steve, and Victoria, who's in EBRD, and it's about remote work. So I'm going to skip the motivational slides, given that everyone here knows the implications and importance of the topic. So I'll just start tell you what we're doing in this paper. So we are focusing on a major call center in Turkey that transitioned from office to complete fully remote work. And what we do is we follow workers, their performances, etc., or firm-level outcomes before, during, and in the post-COVID period. That's roughly 2019 to 2022. And then the data is a very rich one. That's what makes this topic or this study quite interesting, is that we have extremely rich admin data, individual level, and which we complement also with some survey that we rolled out ourselves. And we have several different questions in this paper. I'm going to show you results from a few of them, not all of them, especially given that I have 15 minutes. Almost, no, not really. Okay, sorry. Yes, so the first question is the employee mix. So how does switching from office to fully remote affected the employee mix? Now that people can work from anywhere they want, did that have an effect? Then, of course, performance, right? So how does transition affect worker productivity? Did it differ across different gender, people by gender, education, etc.? And then we try to also say something about the importance of initial in-office experience and how it matters, whether it matters for learning, etc. And then, of course, the quality, right? So performance could be coming at the cost of quality, so we also look into that. And to give you an overview of the main results, first of all, we find that switching from office to remote work increased the proportion of older workers. I mean, here the average age is quite low, so just workers became slightly older. They became more educated. And interestingly, they became, the share of married women has increased. And I'll tell you why that is important in this specific context. And then also, people living outside of metropolitan areas, their shares start increasing, indicating a geographical diversification. Then in terms of performance, in this context, we find positive effect on performance. So we find that workers, after switching to remote work, spent less time on the individual calls, but because they processed the calls faster, that allowed them to process more calls per hour. And they took less breaks. They are entitled to a certain amount of breaks, but they took less of them, which increased the number of time they spent working. And then we do not find any effects on the quality of the services. So they processed more calls, but it did not come at the expense of service quality. So it's briefly related to, this work is related to the implication of remote work on worker mix. So what kind of workers are recruited? Does it change the composition? So yeah, in the interest of time, I'm just going fast. But then also this paper is clearly related to the papers that look at the performance or productivity angle. So the results there is a bit mixed. So we contribute to that mixed picture with finding some positive effects. And then, of course, this is related to what makes remote work potentially more productive. Like what are the things that might make office less productive compared to home? And then I think we can say a few things on that, given, in this specific context. And of course, what are the potential gains from remote work, whether it's in terms of performance, but it could be also about happiness, satisfaction, etc., so which we try to understand in this paper. So let me tell you a bit about the company. So this is Tempo. This is a company. This is the most important call center or Turkish-owned call center services provider. They're OK with us using their name, hence Tempo. So we can use their name. So they've been there for more than 20 years. They have offices in 7 provinces in Turkey, with the HQ being in Istanbul, which is the economic capital. What they do is they provide call services to many different clients, like banks, mobile phone operators, embassies, etc. And overall, just to give you an idea, we have, they're structured in teams. So they have 20 call center agents who are supervised by a team leader, and then these team leaders are supervised by supervisors. So this is kind of the structure of the operational part. And then you have, of course, the management. So a bit about the context. So basically, Turkey, as in the rest of the world, or most parts of the world, imposed a very sudden, unexpected national lockdown that was imposed to everyone and the nationwide. So it started in March 2020 and lasted till September 2021. Afterwards, these restrictions were lifted and Turkey entered the post-COVID period. As I mentioned, Tempo is a major company, the most important Turkish company in this sector, and they have around 3,500 agents, so agents, call center agents. And all of them were moved to transition to remote work within 2 weeks. So they basically gave them laptops. They even unplugged the computers, desktop they had in the offices, just make sure that they could do the transition. So it was a big operation, but they handled it well, and they really managed to do the transition. What is interesting, or what is important in this case for us, is that technology or compensation policies have not changed. So they still use the same system. Their incentives are still the same, or was the same compared to pre-period. The only difference being that now they were processing the calls at home. And because this worked out so well, that in the post-lock period, Tempo continued working remotely. So now they use their offices only for specific cases, but they really operate fully remotely. And apparently, this is kind of also the case for the sector, at least in Turkey. So everyone closed their offices. Now they're fully remote. So to give you an idea about Tempo or the working conditions, this is a photo that was taken before the pandemic. As you can see, it's crowded. There are many people around. It's very loud. Of course, it's a bit convivial because they're sharing drinks, etc. But it is a very noisy environment. We had some focus groups, and they were telling us the thing that came again and repeatedly was this noise aspect. Another problem they had was that they had lazy workers. So this guy, that's when he was in the office. We took him on the paper. He gave us good insights, and now he's working remotely from here. He's on his lunch break. So, hence. Yeah. So yeah.
Was that right? Were you working?
Yeah, that's him. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, as you can see, they were not very serious when working. Anyway, so now that they are fully remote, this is from today, or these are pictures that they took for us. Basically, you can see that they are working alone in a much cleaner and quieter environment. Let me briefly tell you about the data. So we have individual level data covering all employees in the company between 2019 and 2022. This is, those who are familiar with this sector would know that this is a sector that has very small profit margins, and they really do need to have precise measures on the performance. They need to really track the performance. So that's why they have detailed information on the demographic characteristics of these workers, but also daily production numbers. So they know the number of calls they received, how long these calls lasted, how much time, how many breaks did employees take, at what time of the day, etc. Then, of course, the service quality. We have 3 different measures. I'll tell you about them in the coming slides. And then, of course, we know when the employees started in the company or they left, or whether they got a promotion, the exact date, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, we have information on type of calls that these employees are getting. I will tell you why that might matter. So, we have the data for the whole company. And the company, as I said, they provide services to different sectors. But we did not want to use all of them because we wanted to extract a project and focus on something that will satisfy certain criteria. So we wanted to make sure the project that we're going to focus on started prior to the pandemic and still continuing today. We wanted to make sure that they had also a lot of call center agents. We have a largest sample possible. And then we did not want to look at a project whose content might have changed. The type of task that they're doing might have changed. So what we're left is, here we're not allowed to tell the name of the company, is left with the most important project of this company, which is with a mobile telecom company. So they're basically providing back office services for this company. We focus on, as you know, there could be two types of calls, outbound and inbound. Outbound means when they call you to sell your product. Inbound is when the customer calls them to sort out the problem or maybe change the name, address, and the billing address, etc. So we focus on inbound because this is the one that doesn't have the cyclicality. There are no different marketing periods, etc. It's really the same stuff all the time. And yeah, so customers call them. These calls are randomly dispatched to workers. We have we have two panels, or two samples. The first sample is what we call the full sample. So we have 1,766 employees, but that is the number of individuals that joined or left the company during the entire period. So the composition does change. And then we also focus on a subgroup of workers. There's 204 of them that have been in the company since the pandemic, and they're still there. So the advantage of focus on this group is the composition does not change. So what I will do is I'll show you the results with the balance panel. But then, of course, with the link, there's always a link for the full sample, and the results always are in line. So let me tell you briefly about the outcomes. So the first outcome, which is which we use as a proxy for performance, which is also what is used by the company, is the number of calls per hour. So how many calls an agent processed per hour worked. Then, of course, there's also the call duration, how long each call lasted. So there you have the talk time, which is the time that they spend with the customer, talking to the customer. Admin time is when they log in the details or conclude the dossier, the file and conclusion of this call. And the hold time is when they put the customer on hold to ask questions that they don't, whose answer they don't have. So they look around, they ask their managers or colleagues for the answer to a specific question. And then we have the break time, which is basically the time that they take as a break. They are entitled to 1 hour of break per day, so we know when and how much they spend on those on breaks. For performance quality or service quality, we have 3 alternative measures that we use together to make sure, in the sense that we run regressions with all of them, to make sure that the way we define the results are not driven by a certain type of measure. So the first one is this performance rating, which is given to an agent every month by their team leader. It's a composite index that takes into account a lot of things, the performance, attitude, etc. So every agent gets it every month. Then we have an alternative measure, which is called sufficient manager rating. This is basically another team that focuses on the quality. This is like a quality team. They basically listen to 10 random calls per month for each employee, and they decide whether the employee satisfies the conditions. And this is a separate team, and they do it to everyone. And then finally, the customer rating, which is basically the customers, what they give after they hang up, before they hang up, after they call. So we use all of them together. So basically, this is our sample. We have, so if we split the sample to 2 groups, we have the balanced panel, so those whose the composition has not changed, and the unbalanced, which has entries and exits. Overall, what you're seeing is the mean age is around 25 for the unbalanced, slightly older for the balanced. The share of women is quite high, around 60%. Those with university degree represent 1/3 of the workers. So the share of married is around 0.14, 0.17. Then we have the process calls, so number of calls that each individual has done. Naturally, it's higher. The mean is higher when it comes to balanced panel because these are the workers who worked longer period. Experience, team size. So team size is roughly the same. So they have 20 people. And if there's someone who drops out, they make sure to replace that person. So the team averages are, in general, around 20. And naturally, if you spend more time in the company, you have had more team leaders. You've been exposed to different team leaders, whereas if you're in an unbalanced panel, so you might have had a shorter tenure and less. So let me tell you briefly about the results. So overall, the first thing we look at is the employee mix. So how does a permanent shift to remote work affect employee mix? So this is the map of Turkey, and these are all NUTS 3 regions. There are 81 provinces. This is a distribution of workers in our project. So as you can see, they're mostly in the southeast of Turkey, which is a very rural, poor, low education, low average education, etc. So they were mostly living in that area. Then, when they switched to remote work, or at least in 2022, this is the distribution, again, of the employees of the same project, but as you can see, they're geographically more scattered, because now they don't have to go to office. So first, we run a regression to look at whether the correlates of our individual characters, whether individual characteristics have changed for those who were hired since the pandemic. So here is a regression. It's a simple one. So basically, if the individual was hired after a certain date, gets 1, or otherwise 0. So we split the period into different periods. So basically, the first column tells you that since the national lockdowns, relative to the pre-pandemic or pandemic period, the workers are slightly older. They're more likely to be female and married. Well, not and, or married. Education-wise, we don't see any difference, at least it's significant. And then, importantly, as I mentioned, now that they don't have to go to the office, the location, they are more likely to be, well, not more, yeah, they are more likely to be recruited outside of a metropolitan province. So this suggests that there's a bit of, yeah, I'll speed up. Then, of course, now that we looked at the entries, how about the exits? So this is, again, another simple regression where we say, give 1 to the individual agent if the individual worked in the company for 3 months or more, 6 months more, or 12 months or more. And we look at these dummies, which, again, compare individuals who were recruited before the pandemic compared to those who were recruited during or post-period. So what you can see here is that individual agents who were recruited during the pandemic or afterwards, since the switch to remote work, are less likely to stay in the company. So the exit rates are higher. And this is a problem the company has because everyone is leaving the company or there's a higher turnover. Beyond that, we see that women are slightly more likely to stay in the company, potentially because it allows them to balance their responsibilities at home and at work. And beyond that, we don't see any characteristics that are really, they stand out. So overall, we see that composition is changing. Then let me briefly tell you about the performance. So how does the complete transition affect worker productivity? This is us plotting the number of calls per hour. And as you can see, each line, red line, delineates the period. So the first one is when the national lockdowns were imposed. Second one was when they were lifted. As you can see, prior to pandemic, or since the pandemic, on average, the number of calls have increased. And as you can see, there are 2 markers. One of them is for the full sample, where the composition is not fixed. And the red one is for the fixed panel, so 204 employees. And empirically, what we do is we run a simple OLS at the individual level. And we have, so where the left-hand side is any outcome that we're interested in. And then we have dummies for to capture the effects of the during period. So that's the time when they switched to remote work, but there were also national lockdowns. And then the post period when they still stayed at home, but they were allowed to go out. So these are 2 different periods. We control for, of course, age squared, etc. But also for, well, I think it's in the, then we have also control for the experience by taking the log of cumulative calls that they have processed till that day. We have information on the type of calls that they have received. That's the composition of calls, the CT. So basically, we make sure that it's not the type of calls that have changed that might have affected the outcomes. And then, of course, we have lots of fixed effects, which I will tell you in the next slide. But just to finish, we cluster the errors at the agent level. So what kind of fixed effects we have? So first fixed effect we have is the individual fixed effect. So that allows us to capture any unobserved heterogeneity that might affect performance of the worker. Then we have team leader and supervisor fixed effects to make sure that these changes are not driven by managerial practices. Then we have dummy for calendar month, right? January to February, etc. And then week of the day fixed effect, which is basically, Mondays are easier than Fridays, or Wednesdays are, etc., etc. And this is the main result for performance. Here, what you're seeing is basically 3 columns, so 3 outcomes, and you have during, post, so these are the dummies, and then the control for experience. What you can see here is that basically, compare the pre-pandemic period, agents processed 0.61 more calls per hour during the COVID period, but this increased to 0.8 even in the post-pandemic, indicating that there has been potentially some learning process. They have become better at it. Then, as they process more calls, it's mainly because they spend less time on calls. So you can see that during the pandemic, they spent 14 or 15 seconds less per call, or 17% in the post-pandemic. Finally, they took less breaks. This is something that the company recognized. So basically they are less likely to use the breaks that they're entitled to. And then, of course, we can break down the call duration. What we see here is that basically the reduction in call duration came thanks to the fact that they spent less time on the call. I will speed up. Then one thing that you would be interested in, so who benefited the most, or were these effects uneven across workers depending on their performance, in-office performance. So here what we do is we group workers into 3 groups as high, medium, and low productivity based on their performance, in-office performance prior to lockdowns. And we interact them with these period dummies. So what we find, what we find is that the positive effects, so good workers, high performance workers, they were doing well already. It's mostly the people in the medium and especially the low productivity that they really seen the biggest boost in their performance. So it kind of suggests that it has contributed to convergence of performance. Then, if we look at by gender, it seems that the women, they seem to adapt less well compared to men. This stands out, especially in the post-COVID period. Then, of course, you might say, great, they are processing more calls, but then how about the service quality? Here, you're seeing the results for the balanced group, as usual, with 3 different metrics, right? Performance, sufficient manager, and customer rating. So what you see is that during the COVID, there was a small increase in the positive increase in performance and sufficient manager, no effect on customer ratings, and in post-COVID, they disappear. So overall, so if I open this slide show you the result for full sample, there you have everything just positive. So there is an increased service quality has increased for the full sample. But if you keep the composition fixed, what you see is that, it's not really robust, but at least what we see is that there's the improved productivity did not come at the expense of service quality. At least for us, that's already good enough. I have 6 minutes, so yeah, feel free to interrupt and ask your questions, or I'll briefly tell you about the initial in-office experience. So this is very new, so any thoughts are welcome. Here, what you're seeing is we are plotting, this is the figure where we plot the calls per hour that an employee processes over time. So as the employee gets more experience, as we see that the calls per hour increase, and then plateaus at a certain level. So what we do is we focus on a subgroup of workers who started, or who all of them applied to the company prior to the lockdowns, but some of them started just before and after. So those who started just before they start in the office whereas those whose first day of work was after the national lockdown, they had to start remotely alone. So it's basically, we have this dummy, we have this subgroup of workers around around the window, and now we basically say, look at the importance of starting in the office versus not. And then what we find is that, again, this is ongoing, so any thoughts are more than welcome. What we seem to find is that the interaction of start in the office and experience seems to be important or larger. Like, what means that for individuals who started remotely, in the office, the experience or more processing more calls contributed more to their learning. But then you might be wondering, this is actually a bit of an artifact. This is, we're plotting the number of calls per hour for two groups. So the red ones are those who start in the office, and the blue ones are those who started remotely. As you can see, those who started remotely, they started from a higher level, and it did not change too much. So they processed roughly the same number of calls per hour over the time as they get more experience. In contrast, those who started in the office started with a lower level, at a smaller level, but they converged in a span of maybe, I think, 2 weeks almost. So those 2,000 calls around that. So it took them a bit longer to learn the ropes, but then they quickly caught up. And then you can see the same thing for the call duration. Those in the office, they would start with much longer calls, etc. But so it seems, at least at the moment, the office is not necessarily gives you a boost when you start. It kind of actually maybe slows you down. It could be because onboarding takes more time, or maybe there's more noise. But this is something we need to understand better. And then, of course, we did some further analysis. We look at whether some workers are more likely to quit. Basically, the workers, in terms of quit the panel here, that's the question. So what we find is that in terms of observable characteristics, we don't see, or at least gender demographics, employees are not more likely. There's no difference in terms of quit rates or quits from the panel. But then we find that those who have higher average productivity, they are more likely to leave the company. So this suggests that in the balanced panel, we have those with the lowest productivity or lower levels of productivity. So all the positive effects we find is potentially the lower bound effects. Promotions, we look at who gets promoted, the usual stuff. If you perform well, higher productivity, etc. Your service quality is good, you get promoted. And now we also use alternative robustness tests where we have alternative measures of experience, and the results don't change. To conclude, we find that permanent shift to remote work has increased performance of call center agents without reducing the service quality. We do not find much evidence on the heterogeneity by education, age, or marital status. There are some effects by gender. We seem to find that the workers least productive in the office benefited the most or seen the biggest increase in their productivity levels after switch to remote work. Starting in the office seems to be important, but there is something going on there for learning, but we need to maybe understand better. And then we rolled out a survey to identify the mechanisms behind the performance improvement. So we looked at whether having a good setup at home matters, or your relationship to a manager, or child duties or elderly duties. But that will be for the next presentation. So with that, I conclude. Thank you very much. Of course, that's a great question. Here, the issue with this study is that they are already working remotely. So we don't know, and then we don't have information on their seating plans prior to pandemic. That we cannot know. But then what we know is that we can, of course, look whether they're in the same team. So that we can do. That could give us something. And then maybe we can also mention that we're actually working on that at the moment, but that's a separate project, and that involves an RCT where we bring some people back to the office. We try to look at the seating plan. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Manuela Collis. I'm a doctoral student at the Rodman School of Management at the University of Toronto. And this is co-author work with Clementine van Effenter, who unfortunately couldn't be here. This is definitely going to be about work experience. And we're going to think about that in the context of remote work. So, a large body of literature has documented that non-wage job amenities is an important component of job quality, and that it's also contributing to the wage disparities. Literature very recently has looked at the value of commuting time, workplace safety, and meaningful work. A disability that has received increased attention in recent years is workplace hostility. The Pew Research Center has created a survey and asked people, what is the major reason that you left your position? And the number one, okay, the titles are cut off. Here it's not, it's cut off. But yes, perfect, thank you. Thank you. So the survey shows that among the three major reasons why people leave a position are actually the number 2 and number 3 are related to hostility in the workplace. That is, feeling disrespected and having no or a lack of opportunities at work is a major reason people say they leave their current position. And there is some evidence when you look at the labor market that this may not be, or this may differ by gender, the importance of workplace hostility. So what you do here is on the y-axis, we have by the occupation, the share of women in the workplace, and on the on the y-axis, sorry, that was on the x-axis, on the y-axis, we plot how important is a positive interaction at work. And as that becomes more important, you see more women actually in the workplace. So there's something perhaps going on. Now, the demand for information on the workplace quality is actually really high, but it's really hard to acquire. Why is it hard to acquire? Because people worry about fear of intimidation and retaliation. There is a study by Laura Boudreau and co-authors which shows that with an intervention, they get people to report way more cases of sexual harassment. In fact, that goes up by 270%. And other work suggests similarly that just types of workplace hostility are severely underreported. Now, therefore, it's hard to accurately consider workplace climate when making work decisions or job decisions. Now, the climate and its perception may actually vary by workplace arrangement. There is some work that shows when people or when women work remotely that they experience less conflict and everyday discrimination. Now, that's something that people here in the room very well. Hybrid work has increased a lot in the past years, in part because of COVID, right? This is data from people in the room. Now, the research questions of our paper are as follows. First, what attributes contribute to a workplace that's hostile? Second, how much do people value those attributes, and how does that vary by gender? And third, how do work arrangements, such as hybrid work, affect the evaluation of hostility? Now, what we do is we first would read through the literature to understand what are, or kind of to identify what are the attributes of workplace hostility. We then run a survey experiment that allows us to evaluations, and then we actually, to look at the labor market equilibriums, we then pair that with a model, those experimental estimates. And what we find is that, well, we identify 4 attributes. Those 4 attributes are lack of personal growth, lack of inclusion. Is that my hair that bothers the, yeah, mic, perfect. Lack of inclusion, aggression, and sexual harassment. And we do find that people, both men and women, value workplaces free of hostility a great deal, between 15 and 36% of their current wage. But we do see that women value inclusion and workplace that's free of hostility, of sexual harassment, significantly more than men do. Now, we also see when we look kind of into substitution, we see that women value hybrid work twice as much if there is perceived, and we get at that in a bit, perceived sexual harassment in the workplace or actual sexual harassment in the workplace. And this leads to overrepresentation of men, and that's, I think, a really nice segue from the previous presentation, overrepresentation of men in the office and women in hybrid work. We contribute to, we think, three streams of literature. One is non-monetary job entities and work sorting, interpersonal dynamics and their implications on gender and racial differences in the labor market, and hybrid or remote work and the gender inequality. Okay, so I'm going to first introduce now the experiment so that you understand what we're doing. We then go through the results, and then we think more about that interaction between hostility and remote work. So what we do is we both we recruit graduating students who right now make decisions about what job they want to accept, but also alumni who have had experience in the workplace, right? We invite both groups, and we get about equally many, to take a survey. The survey will have 13 scenarios, and this is in the form or in the framework of a conjoint analysis where they get 2 jobs, which vary across different factors. We're going to talk about that on the next slide. And they always get 2 jobs, and they have to make a decision which ones, if they had to start it in the next 30 days, would they actually accept. Job A versus job B. And that will then allow us to actually add a weight amount to each of those attributes. This is paired with information about their current job, about whether they have had experience with hostility, and what is their expected risk of experiencing hostility in the future. And this is pre-registered. Okay, so this is one of those decisions that they actually make. I will talk just in a second about how we actually developed or how we decided those are the 4 attributes that create hostility, but these are kind of the 4 attributes. There is the work location, whether it's in person or hybrid. There is teamwork that I'm not going to talk about in this presentation, but whether it's team or solo work, and their wage. The wage, importantly, is related to their actual wage. So we ask them, what do you earn right now? And then we add a multiplier, and that will just exogenously vary what type of wage we would offer them. Now, what makes a workplace hostile? And we've actually spent a lot of time on them, and it's not that we want to create a definition of workplace hostility, we just try to understand what does it consist of and how can we study that quantitatively. So what we did is we went through the literature in psychology, organizational behavior, who have studied this extensively, sociology and economics. And here are some themes, though it's obviously way more excessive than that, of what kind of the literature thinks of when they think of workplace hostility. Now, we have collected all adjectives and definitions of that literature, and then iteratively reduced that to 4 distinct attributes. And those attributes are, as we have alluded to before, lack of professional growth, so kind of feeling stuck in a job, for example, aggression, any form of undermining, bullying, or similar type of aggression, lack of inclusion, any form of ostracism, social exclusion and isolation, and sexual harassment. And we then had to develop language that actually can be shown to people. And what we did is kind of to be more true to what people would experience in the real world. We went to Indeed and other platforms to collect information on actual reviews people wrote on jobs, because increasingly they can actually rate workplace climate, which is why we think this is also in part really interesting to study. So we collected in language that's related to our attributes, and then we just created it in a more stylized fashion so that it can be used in an experiment. And I don't expect you to read all of that, but to give you a sense of what that sounds, aggression, for example, reads, the workplace fosters a culture of friendly interactions, instances of aggression are rare. Versus, the environment is very much cutthroat, bullying does happen, and intimidation is frequent and seen as a tool to make you work harder. Now, we distributed that to the set of the population I mentioned, we recruited from various different disciplines, which was important for us, studying gender. They are incentivized to complete the survey financially, but also we offer them actually to send them the results. And people were really interested in that, so 70% of people wanted actually the research paper once we have written it up. And this for us is also a sign of engagement, that people actually care about this survey and answer truthfully, right? We also have, for part of the survey, it's actually consequential. So for part of the participants, they know, because we have told them that their answers will actually impact the university's programming. It's a sort of a soft way of inducing incentive compatibility. Now, to kind of work now through the results, what we can see is people value workplaces free of hostility quite a lot, between around 15% of their wage to 36% of their wage, depending on the amenity. And these are the different attributes. We have also hybrid work and teamwork plotted here. And this varies. I think what's really nice is about the distribution, right? We can see how in agreement people are about that, and this varies quite a bit, where for actually a workplace free of sexual harassment, that varies quite a lot how much people care about that. What's kind of nice to see is that most people do actually care. So there's not a lot of mass on the -0 side. Now, how does that vary by gender, right? That's something we're looking at in this paper. We see that, again, everyone actually values workplaces free of hostility, but there are some differences. Women care more about an inclusive workplace and about a workplace that is free of sexual harassment. Okay, those results are robust to various different specifications, to different subsamples. We have also compared it with other findings in the field, and it seems fairly comparable. And I say that obviously because I want to acknowledge this is a hypothetical choice experiment, but it seems actually everything has been extremely stable. Now, what drives demand for a workplace that's free of hostility? Is it a luxury good, which we think it is not? It's quite stable across the wage of people. It's also not really the case that people who are likely to have less outside options, that they value it less. So it seems to be a fairly stable preference of people across different places. What we do find is people actually underestimate how much other people value a workplace free of hostility. People think others are more willing to accept a workplace with hostility than they are themselves. And I think that's really interesting and may have actually managerial implications. And then third, and this is I think where it's really getting interesting for this group, is what about the substitution, right? Well, what we find, and that's in line with previous work, is that reported risk of hostility increases with on-site and teamwork. So that's kind of a good sanity check. But the second two things are past experience of aggression and sexual harassment is associated with an increased valuation of hybrid work. So people may actually be sorting. Thirdly, women, and I mentioned that before, women's valuation of being able to work remote or hybrid at least is twice as much if they know there is risk of sexual harassment. Now, to go beyond our sample and think more about the labor market equilibrium, we worked through a model to understand this more and to kind of bring in the intuition. What if I have the perception that there is hostility, and we will narrow it down to sexual harassment, that there's a risk of sexual harassment in the workplace. How does my decision to accept the job impact that perception? Or like, how does that impact my decision, my perception, if it's either in person versus hybrid? And we work through a compensating wage differential model where the first amenity is whether the job is in person versus online. The second amenity that is unobserved is whether there is sexual harassment. Now, our assumptions are that sexual harassment only takes place in the in-person job, that it's not possible hybrid, and that people don't actually have a good understanding of how frequent that is. They really rely on our perception. We then use a technological shock that impacts the productivity costs of remote work. So how accessible suddenly becomes hybrid work to employees. And then we kind of run simulations. Those simulations, we then, I'm going to talk about kind of the predictions in a second. We compare them with actually with an approach where we use the work from home survey that has been done, right, on a very regular basis, and we exploit that where we use we kind of essentially create two type of industries. One where the COVID shock has created really an uptake in hybrid work, where how we read that is that actually the cost of hybrid work decreases a lot, versus industries where that's not happened so much, where we think it must be hard actually to move to hybrid work, and so the costs may be higher there, the production costs. We then use our own estimates to plug in kind of the wage differentials between on-site and remote work. And then we predict participants' earnings. And the results are fortunately in line really with our predictions. Now, what are our model predictions? Well, we find that on-site wage premiums is an increasing function of mu b, which is that productivity cost of remote work, and the probability of sexual harassment. So firms are actually willing to pay an additional compensation to worker for working on-site. And then kind of as a next step is, well, what happens if that mu b changes, right? That's kind of that technological shock that may suddenly happen, where we have a different world, where suddenly the costs of working remotely are going down. And what we find is that men are then more likely to be observed in the office, not because of differences in valuation for hybrid work, but actually because of their difference in perception about the risk of sexual harassment. And that will increase the average workers' rent in the office, which are more likely to be men. Now, as the chance or the perception of the risk of sexual harassment in the office increases, that will just increase essentially that sorting effect. So we'll see more men in the office, and like an overrepresentation of men in the office, an overrepresentation of women on hybrid work, and that will have implications for the gender wage gap. Now, to take it all together, we have high valuations of workplaces that are free of hostility, and that is true across the board essentially, with some differences that women value a workplace that's inclusive and free of sexual harassment significantly more. This has implications for sorting in the labor market. Women are more likely to be sorting into hybrid jobs if there is a perception that there is a risk of sexual harassment. Now, we think that this has implications for firms' policy, right, as they want employees to come back into the office. And I think more broadly, this creates that conversation about the workplace quality now in sort of a new world where we have that choice of working remotely versus working in person. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This is really exciting work, and I'm really pleased to see that you're doing this. I was curious about how you're thinking about perceptions, because you sort of vacillated when you were talking about perceptions versus actual probability of negative experiences in the workplace, and whether there's sort of a possibility of learning when one is in the workplace, right? If you have some perception of your chances versus when you actually are in person and you learn and update accordingly. This might be outside your model, but I do think that it's a relevant extrapolation as we're thinking about return to the office.
So in experiment, we actively tell them so they know, right? So there is essentially, well, if you have that knowledge, what would you do? And we think increasingly, and so I want to say, I feel historically ex ante, we all have essentially the perception. We have an idea, maybe we gather a bit of information, but it's really hard to get that information. So sorting is I expect sorting is really expected to happen on perception, but increasingly we have indeed in Glassdoor who are increasing that volume of information. So I expect, if anything, the sorting should actually increase as that becomes more granular, right? We can then talk about, is it the manager that matters? And we have some evidence that they care more about hostility coming from the manager versus their peers. So that's then kind of a next conversation. Yeah. Thank you.
A couple things. I didn't get a clear sense of magnitude from the presentation. So in particular, aside from, what would be the value to a company, according to your preferred model and number, of reducing the perceived incidence of sexual harassment in on-site work? How much less can it pay and still attract the same quality of persons? That was the first question. Second, I also found it difficult to distinguish between what you were claiming about your model implies and what you were claiming about what's in the evidence, in the patterns and the data. And maybe you weren't even trying to speak to the latter, but I would think when you're trying to evaluate the predictions of your model relative to what you see in the data, there's a big challenge in that there are other attributes of remote work, aside from the hostility of the environment, that enter into the perceived amenity value of remote work and hence the compensating differentials. Those two things that didn't come through clearly to me, at least. And maybe you can speak to them.
Thank you. So the conjoint analysis allows us to understand how much firms could pay less to attract certain types of workers, right? And so technically, they could pay 36% less, but have a zero tolerance of sexual harassment, and they should be able then to attract way more women than what they do now. So that's essentially kind of the mechanics of how we should think about this wage. Right now, they cannot screen, and so I think the interesting part here is they cannot actually screen on preference of sexual harassment. Likely, that will be then selecting by gender, and that's illegal. So there is kind of that interesting kind of component for firms of how they cannot give me a different wage to you if we believe in the average, that we represent the average, right? That would be illegal to do, but that would be the efficient thing for them to do.
No, I'm not following. First, I want to make sure I understood the claim. You're saying that the average woman would be willing to take a 36% wage cut
Average
to
person.
move to a job that had no sexual harassment?
Yeah. That's what our
That seems too big to believe relative to the current norm. That's kind of one reaction.
Yep.
But then I don't see, if that really were true, well, I don't see what's the barrier to firms trying to improve their environment in that respect. The legal barrier. You said there's some kind of legal barrier. I didn't get that argument.
So in our scenario, there is essentially a guaranteed risk of sexual harassment. And when we compare our estimates to other work that has more, speaks more to like, well, there are sexist comments. Sexist comments is something a bit less severe than sexual assault, for example. And so if I were to choose, if the average woman were to choose a job where she knows there's a high risk of sexual assault, then suddenly becomes really important, or she thinks about wage potentially differently. That's kind of how you get in context, that's how you can think about that.
I want to make sure I understand. So if
I wanna
sexual
make sure
harassment in your context is sexual assault, I understand, but is that the way that, I didn't see that in the questions. They were less specific than that, so I'm still confused.
No, what I'm trying to say is not sexual assault, but that definitely can be part of it. But what I'm saying is there is a high certainty that sexual harassment will be in the workplace. And I mean, I can only speak for the data, right? The data suggests that people are willing to forgo a high share of their wage to ensure that they don't actually have to be in a workplace that is very high chance of sexual harassment.
Okay, thanks. I'm brand new to all this work on workplace hostility. I'd love to know about the selection of workers that I'd be a little worried about imposing a policy in my workplace that was like no aggression, because I worry that you may be it could be that your less productive employees are the ones that are especially hostile to any sort of hostility, if you will. And I'd love to, maybe you could proxy for GPA. I mean, you don't really know these people's productivity, but I'd like to see some proxy for their resume and their GPA to sort of see, okay, these are the people that and this I think would get at the efficiency of company-wide policies on sexual harassment. So, there's always this question, Like suppose I won't disparage my employer, suppose you're Utah State, and you have the opportunity to hire a Nobel Prize winner, but the Nobel Prize winner is known to be a serial sexual harasser. Is this going to improve the productivity of your economics department? I don't know. It depends on the sort of externalities, and like maybe the only people that really are bothered by this are not super productive. And anyway, I'd love to see like who in your worker pool, if you can proxy for that in some way. I think that'd be really useful at getting sort of at the optimal policy.
So we have 2 projects that go at exactly that. One of them hopefully be my job market paper that looks exactly at that. Who is actually affected? How does it impact productivity entirely? Now, I think what you're also asking is who then would be, if I say there's let's say a zero tolerance hostility, who would benefit and who would lose? I think that's also part of your question. And that is not something that I can get at. What we can say is that there's not really a lot of variation by industry, if that is in any way an indicator for productivity. But yeah, we don't have ideal data to answer that question. Thank you.
First, I just wanted to ask a clarifying question about how the experiment worked. So how many different choices did each subject make between jobs?
So there are 2 jobs. And then they select whether they want job A or job B. So it's a binary choice between 2 jobs.
Right.
But they make that decision 13 times. So I give you 2 jobs and you tell me job A looks more attractive to me. Okay. And then I'm like, great, thanks for your answer. I'm going to give you another 2 jobs. Now, which one of those do you prefer? And what's important to know is it varies exogenously. We randomly throw essentially those attributes at each of those jobs. So you will make different trade-offs. So in one job, it'll be trade-off between inclusion and aggression, and the other one will be between sexual harassment and job growth. And then the salary will also vary exogenously. So
you had those 4 types of unpleasant work environments that you randomized, and then also remote.
Yes, remote work, but also teamwork. That's something I didn't talk about at all. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. And so off of 13 binary choices for each person, you're estimating these
at the sample
effects.
level then, exactly. So we have over 2,000 participants. Which is also, so I think we're very confident in our results, but then as soon as we go into, by industry and like we try to understand more heterogeneous effects, then it becomes hard because we may really lose power at that point,
So I was also concerned about the same thing that Steve raised about how this sort of 36% pay cut sounds awfully high.
Yeah.
So I think you're saying that you believe it because you're specifying that like sexual harassment is definitely occurring in this company, and it's definitely not occurring in this.
And that is the estimate for sexual harassment. So the others are lower, right? That's the extreme of the values. The other one are 15% around more in that area. Yes.
But I also wondered whether we should be concerned about the hypothetical nature of the choices, that maybe people are exaggerating how much money they'd be willing to give up.
Yeah, so we have many slides on robustness, which I am not talking about here for time reasons. So we have, for example, their stated we have their stated work environment, and then we look at their willingness to pay for example, remote work or teamwork, and it's very comparable. So if I am working remotely already, then I actually value in our experiment, I actually value remote work more. So there's a lot of sensitivity checks that we do, and try to understand, almost half of the sample has an incentive compatibility in it, because their choices are consequential, because the university will actually use our data for programming. So there's all sorts of things that we do to actually measure or look.
It's consequential at the individual level, or just for how the policy
at the
is
group
designed?
level. Yeah. But we're working on a lab experiment where we plan to replicate it for exactly those concerns. But we're fairly comfortable with the estimates, just given how many sensitivity checks we have run. Thank you everyone for your time.
I'm a psychologist by training and very interested in understanding factors that predict well-being. So today I'm going to be presenting research from a pre-registered study that I ran in collaboration with a large tech company, looking at whether time management interventions can improve the subjective employee experience. In general, this fits with a broader line of research where I'm interested in understanding descriptively the relationships between how people spend time at work and outside of work and how that predicts well-being, and trying to provide some causal evidence that shifting the way people spend time at work and outside of work can also predict well-being. More recently, I've started to look at the role of informal and formal workplace practices in shaping the employee experience. And today, this is really where this research fits. Sort of thinking about what are the strategies and interventions that individuals and managers really can use to try to improve the employee experience, particularly in the context of knowledge workers engaging in collaborative work. So this is part of a broader interest, in part because stress is on the rise for working adults all over the world. This is Gallup World Poll data. The trends just continue up and to the right, unfortunately. So this is the proportion of working adults who report experiencing a lot of stress yesterday. Don't pay too much attention to between country comparisons. We could spend all day talking about those. But the main pattern here is that the proportion of working adults who reported experiencing a lot of stress yesterday has significantly increased over the last 2 decades. And there's research suggesting kind of across fields in a conceptual review that my colleagues and I published several years ago, that these feelings of stress and time stress in particular correlate negatively with a host of well-being and productivity-related outcomes. There are many factors that predict stress, one being work-related demands. What I'm going to focus on today is an intervention, sort of thinking about how we might be able to change work structures or change the way that teams collaborate to potentially influence stress and well-being. So there's been a lot of research by a host of people looking at objective time demands and how those may have increased during COVID and sort of coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic era for knowledge workers. So this is some work by a couple of my colleagues looking at Microsoft Calendar and email data during the pandemic and suggesting that the workday expanded. I also do some research with Slack, who found some similar trends even today, showing that the work span has significantly increased, in part because of distributed teams having more emails and digital forms of communication. So this is just me throwing myself under the bus. I study time, but also my calendar can look like this. And many knowledge workers also report a significant increase, again, just illustrating the point from the last slide, of more meetings and a third shift between 7 to 10 p.m. So by some estimates, 30% more knowledge workers are now working a third shift between 7 to 10 p.m., potentially because they're making use of some of that flexibility during the day to engage in personal responsibilities, but also potentially because of work-related demands. So in some qualitative ethnography work that my colleagues and I did with large management consulting firm, kind of tracking management consultants as they shifted from completely in-person to completely remote, we saw that knowledge worker teams needed to be more intentional and deliberate about how they were spending time together. I'm not going to go through all of these results today. I'm going to show you the field experiment. But what we kind of see is that for teams that we studied in management consulting, that they found that process check-ins, things that were supposed to be short check-ins, became very long meetings where people were trying to do a whole bunch of things, talk about work and socialize with each other. We also saw that these informal learning conversations, this learning by observing that used to happen in a team room for management consultants, also qualitatively went missing when teams went back to remote work, and that virtual interaction simply didn't feel the same. So we were kind of advocating for reducing process time, making that asynchronous, increasing the amount of observational learning or these small conversations in between meetings, and trying to increase the quality, but not necessarily the quantity of these interactions. And another key thing, as we saw our management consulting teams kind of move back into hybrid models of work, is that focus time was really difficult, especially when working from the office. So again, going back to a few slides ago, when I showed you teams are collaborating more, they're having more digital communication, it can be more difficult now in distributed models of work to get that focused time that is really essential for individual perceived productivity. So we know from other research that an increased volume of meetings and emails can make it hard to find focus time to complete deep work. I don't think I need to tell any of us in this room that as well. And then constant connection to technology like email and instant messenger, which we rely on now more as our teams are more distributed, can limit attentional focus needed for challenging tasks. And it can also causally, so there's experimental lab research showing that this constant connection can increase stress and undermine well-being. There's a lot of tech companies kind of understanding as they're shifting into hybrid and remote ways of working that we need to help knowledge workers get this focus block of time in their calendar by putting things like Focus Fridays and Maker Weeks in calendars, with this idea that we need to kind of try to help our employees get focus work done while managing multiple competing demands. Despite the popularity or the popular sentiment of these kinds of strategies, very little research in the academic space is known about successful within-day boundary setting, both whether it is actually effective and what the impacts might be. We know that especially in high-performing organizational contexts, that employees signal their commitment to each other and to the organization by responding to emails right away. So this is work by Melissa Mazmanian and others on the ideal worker, which is the idea that we signal our commitment to our organizations and to each other by constantly responding, and that managers do actually differentially sometimes promote people who are the first to the office, the last to leave, and who respond the fastest. So without clear communication norms, employees are likely to respond to email and meeting requests right away, which can get in the way of this focus time, which I've said we all need more of. But most of the research looking at the potential benefits of setting interventions around these focus times, collaboration norm style interventions have been correlational studies, ethnographies, or lab-based research. So in this study, we're going to look at whether time management interventions like focus time strategies can improve the employee experience for hybrid workers. There's some initial evidence from colleagues suggesting that simply adding a line at the end of an email, like this is not urgent, you can get to it whenever you can, significantly reduces the extent to which people think that their colleagues expect a response right away, suggesting that these kinds of interventions can be effective at changing the psychology around digital communication. But again, so these are kind of suggestive results from lab studies that these kind of time management strategies, these informal norms, could potentially reduce the perceived burden of constant responsivity. Yet again, because of this ideal worker norm, it's possible that in an actual organizational context, these norms are going to be ignored or challenged. And so we really want to understand, since we spend a lot of time at work and distributed models of work are more common, whether we can use psychologically informed interventions to improve the experience of work for workers in a high-performing organizational context. So our proposed model, based on some other work that I've done, is that these time management strategies at the team level for employees in hybrid workplaces should reduce the perceived burden of interruption, increase perceived control over time, and improve the employee experience, well-being, reduced stress, and the like. So we're going to focus on a host of subjective well-being related outcomes here. Our field setting is a hybrid workplace, a top technology company. The average team size that we looked at in terms of the intervention was 7, and this is a highly competitive and desirable place to work. So you can see it's extremely competitive. The policy that was in place at the time that we ran the experiment was 3 days in the office. You could apply to work from other offices or work remotely, and you could work from another office up to 4 weeks per year. So this was a pretty standard 3-2 model coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. As part of this project, in another paper that I'm not reporting here, we just looked at all of the archival data of this large organization and asked, where are employees working now? What does the distribution of the employee of teams and employees, what does that look like? What we can see from this table is that teams are highly dispersed. So this used to be a completely in-office organization that's coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic became distributed in part because of these flexible policies. So we can see that only 22% of the workforce in the entire population, the entire organization that we're studying, where the field experiment was run, are entirely co-located with their direct team at the time that we ran this study. Similar to the kind of descriptive findings from other research that I presented, employees in this organization that we surveyed, so 7,000 employees that we surveyed as part of this other project, said that they often, when hybrid, again, this is during the hybrid work policy, Period said that they often had to work outside of their preferred working hours, so they agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. And the majority, 64%, said that they did not feel in control of their time. So these findings are reflective of that kind of broader descriptive picture I was painting from other published work. Okay. We also ran a daily diary study where we tried to look at how remote and office days, what those looked like. So we saw, as you might expect, on days where hybrid workers came to the office, they spent less time on focus work and more time in meetings, which is what the office is designed to do. And on work from home days, hybrid workers' days looked almost identical to individuals who were fully remote. So they had more focused work and less meetings. We saw some correlational evidence in these data that employees who spent more days in the office out of that 3-2, since it was a flexible policy, reported lower levels of focus time, which in turn came at a cost of self-reported productivity and work-relevant well-being. And as I mentioned earlier, but is important to note here in this particular context, employees themselves feel that focused work is productivity. So I think this is interesting as part of the kind of broader debate in hybrid work, is that when you ask employees themselves, they think the work that they're doing, where they're typing on their computer, working on their individual tasks, is what garners productivity for them. Now we can have a discussion over the next couple of days of whether that individual's preference should be taken as firm policy, right? But we see that employees in our sample, when we ask them, say that their most productive time is when they are individually working on their own tasks. We just plotted productivity by time spent in focused work and connection plotted by time spent in meetings, trying to understand how we should design our intervention in terms of the right trade-offs that we should be thinking about. What we can see is that there's sort of a sweet spot. This is from daily diary data. We're spending about 20% of the day in meetings was associated with higher levels of self-reported productivity and connection. So we were trying in our interventions to think about what should we ask, like what should these focus blocks of time look like? What should these interventions be tailored toward? And so our daily diary data suggests from individuals in this organization that employees themselves felt more productive when they spent about 20% of their time, or about 2 hours, on focus work, and that there was a largest marginal increase for self-reported productivity and connection when increasing focused work and meeting time from 0 to 20% to 21 to 40. So we wanted to try to get people at least a couple of hours of focus time, and that's what we intended to do in this intervention. So we recruited 210 managers, or about 1,800 employees, who participated in Group A or Group B. So they had a staggered start. Everyone does the intervention, but just over a different time scale. Teams were asked to complete one 15 to 30-minute norms discussion, and then to have a check-in partway through the experiment. We had 793 employees complete this, all data. So Group A completed a baseline with our employee experience measures, and at week 7 completed an end line. The team norms conversation happened in week 2. There was a midline, a team check-in, and then that end line. And then Group B did a pre-study intake with some basic initial measures so we could control for those. Then they do the baseline at week 7 and the end line at week 13. The comparisons I'm going to show you are comparing the baseline and end line controlling for week 1. We can also stack the data, and the results look statistically similar. The inferences don't change. So what was the design? We asked teams to have a 15 to 30-minute conversation where they would set one of these time management norms with the intention of helping them manage digital distraction, collaboration overload, and some of this inability to get focus time, as I've been mentioning. So teams could choose to designate team focus time to block the same few hours per week, to limit after-hours communication, so delay send non-urgent emails and call only if it's urgent, or to avoid weekend work, to avoid Monday team meetings. Now this one is a little bit aside from the first two, so it's a little bit separate. We wanted to give employees choice over these different interventions. So it's really important, especially when studying subjective well-being and the employee experience, that employees feel like they have choice over what they're doing and what they want to set. So teams were allowed to kind of choose one of these different interventions to follow over the experimental period. We see that 62% selected the focus times, norms, 28% selected limiting after-hours communication, and 10% selected avoiding weekend work. And this is just the same, but kind of the instructions in more detail. So we pre-registered a series of primary well-being and work-relevant experience measures. We also looked at perceived interruptions following the conceptual model laid out at the beginning of the presentation. And we looked at adherence, so whether the team frequently discussed the norm, whether it was easy or difficult to maintain, and whether teams followed it. Of course, we also had objective team dispersion metrics. So I mentioned several slides ago that we had all of this information about where employees were working and where they were working in relation to each other. So we were able to look at whether the team was distributed or co-located, percentage of remote workers, the percentage of workers who were co-located, the time zone variability. Whatever distribution metric you want, we had it and we calculated it and we used them as potential moderators. What's really interesting and was counter to what we were expecting is that none of those dispersion moderators mattered for the results that I'm going to show you, except for some of the heterogeneity on adherence, which I'll talk about in a second. And then the norms, of course, what teams chose. So just looking at the overall main effects, so again, comparing baseline and end line for group A and group B, controlling for time 1. And these are multi-level models with team-level fixed effects. You can see that there's really not that much going on in terms of main effects. We run a series of models in the paper that was circulated, looking at a variety of different ways you could run these regressions, and we sort of see a consistent pattern of results where this intervention seemed to have the strongest benefit for team connection and for this reduced psychological experience of burden interruption. So people felt like they were less burdened by interruptions by their colleagues. Just as an illustrative example, after the study, a significant percent fewer employees said that they experienced work-related interruptions, and significantly more employees said they felt comfortable saying no to interruptions after the intervention. We see some correlational indirect effect evidence that the extent to which employees on teams who had these interventions felt less burdened by these interruptions, they also felt more control over their time and greater positive mood. But again, these are indirect effect analysis. And so really where the action is being driven is on that first path, that the intervention is helping people feel less burdened by interruptions. And to the extent it does that, it has these other positive associations. We also saw really strong effects for adherence. Makes sense. But to get the benefits of these interventions, teams really actually had to do them and take them seriously. So we can see across all of the significant outcomes that adherence following these norms that the team set predict all of the outcomes that we're looking at to a strong degree, as do discussing the intervention itself. So just as an example here again, if you had both norm conversations, the one at the beginning, the one at the midline, there was a stronger percentage of employees who agreed that they felt in control of their time as compared to if you only had 0 to 1 norm conversations, you actually show a significant decrease in perceived control over time over the study. So discussing these interventions and taking them seriously in the workplace had a strong positive predictive effect on all of these employee experience outcomes. So this then leads to this question of which teams, what characteristics of teams were predicting adherence. This may seem very unsurprising, but larger teams, more distributed teams, were less likely to follow the norms that they set. Likely because it was just harder to get everyone on board, going back to the earlier part of my presentation around coordination challenges. Employees personally who reported that they had a harder time detaching from work were also less likely to adhere themselves, as were employees who reported a greater change in workload and who worked outside of their preferred hours at time one. So a takeaway here is that employees who could potentially stand to benefit the most from these kinds of interventions found it the most difficult to adhere. So one kind of actionable takeaway is setting norms in calmer periods could help to improve intervention efficacy. And maybe setting different norms on teams that have more dispersion is something else to think about. But again, the teams chose these, so with the idea they were trying to do whatever they felt like was the most effective, and even there, larger, more distributed teams that were busier had a harder time. So what I'm showing you here is that there was also some exploratory analysis we ran looking at whether not adhering could have a negative impact on the employee experience. We saw that this was in fact supported by the data for small teams. So small teams, in green here, if they were less likely to follow the intervention, reported decreases in positive mood over the course of the intervention. Whereas if anything, you see kind of the opposite for larger teams, that failing to adhere didn't matter as much for how they felt at the end of the study. But for small teams in particular, they felt worse if they failed to adhere to these interventions over the course of the experimental period. And these pattern of results held also for negative mood and perceived stress. So it could be a self-efficacy story. If small teams set these norms, they could potentially be monitoring each other's behavior and seeing that other people aren't doing it and getting frustrated. It could also be a self-efficacy story where smaller teams feel like they should be able to do this, and things must not be very good if they can't follow these small team-based interventions that they're attempting. In some additional heterogeneity analysis, I will say take this with a grain of salt. It doesn't hold in all of the models that I've run, but we see some descriptive evidence that there's a possibility that managers in this sample benefited more from the interventions in terms of perceived control of their time. So managers in some of our models showed a significant increase in their self-reported agreement with feeling more in control of their time at the end of the study, whereas employees, if anything, felt somewhat like individual contributors felt somewhat of a decrease in control over time. Now, you could think about that in terms of how these teams are structured. So employees need managers' time and attention to get their work done. So setting some of these focused blocks of time and strictly adhering to them might preclude employees from potentially getting what they need from a manager. So it could have created more coordination costs for employees as opposed to managers who typically have more discretion and maybe more discretion over their time anyway, and for whom might rely on their team less for some of their deliverables on a day-to-day, granular, hour-by-hour basis. But I think that's a result that's worth more exploration. So a few takeaways. We see that these time-based interventions reduce the psychological burden of work-related interventions and also had this function of helping teams feel more connected to each other, which is always good, especially in distributed and hybrid models of work where it might be harder to find touch points to connect and to share about your personal lives or personal preferences. So we see that as a kind of one result. We see that these kinds of interventions are harder to implement on larger and more distributed teams, and successful adherence is especially critical for small teams in terms of not seeing negative consequences. And there's some tentative provisional evidence that managers benefited more from the autonomy benefits of these interventions than employees. I think it's interesting to think about trying to get teams to manage their time differently in high-performing organizations. I have some other research showing that it's actually these informal kinds of conversational norms, like it's okay to do this, or it's okay if you check out, or it's okay if you ask for more time on an adjustable deadline at work, are not always as effective for getting people to manage their workloads and to experience lower levels of stress than things that are more formal, that are more mandated by organizations, or where there's formal processes involved, like filling out a paperwork or committing, and then your calendar automatically barring you from slacking with each other during that time as a relevant example. And so I think this is, an important question as we think about trying to manage hybrid work. Place policies on a day-to-day basis as a manager. How much should we be sort of mandating, and how much should be discretionary and more informal? So focus time norms are a common time management idea, especially coming out of COVID. I think these data suggest they might have more limited general applicability in the workplace, that formal policies might be more effective, and that we need more work trying to understand how to get these kind of team-based collaborative interventions to be effective in the workplace. And so with that, I'll just thank funders and the RAs here, and then open it up for questions.
Is there a selection effect? So I take the results, and these norms are helpful for making people be more productive, happier, et cetera. I guess one concern employers may have is you do that, and then you select in, I don't know, less hardworking. So
Yeah.
I mean, it seems on its own this is a good idea to do. Is there just a concern you're signaling that you're a place for people that want, I don't know, a slightly less stressful workplace? That might be good, but they may also worry, well, we want to select on, I don't know, driven, hard worker, obsessive people.
Yeah, so I think it is interesting to think about when to signal or offer these kinds of programs, right? So you're kind of talking about at the job attraction level, right? So if I'm going to put out a job ad, and I work with a management consulting firm that kind of does this, like we have all of these programs that are around work-life balance. Certainly, the signal you're sending is I'm an employer who cares about employees and maybe is a little bit more flexible than my collaborator or my competitor rather, and that might be good in some contexts, depending on who you're trying to attract, and less positive in others, which I think is an important kind of broader question about when to be kind of presenting this intervention in particular came out of employee data, some of which I showed you, where employees came back to the office in these hybrid models of work and felt stressed and overwhelmed by managing personal and professional life, by managing teams that were now much more distributed. And so they were looking for strategies, solutions, and interventions to help reduce some of the stress that they were experiencing on already kind of highly productive teams. And so if anything, we show that these teams are so focused on getting their work done that us suggesting some things to them about things that they might do to help manage workload, manage collaboration demands, are largely, or not large, I mean, that some teams are at least ignoring those to get the work done. And then these are not as effective as they could be. And so this story could look different in other contexts, but here they're high-performing individuals really trying to operate at peak efficiency. And here we see, if anything, the organization is so productivity-oriented that it's hard to get people to even move away from their desk or not connect for a couple of hours. And another project I have, they actually show that desk workers in this high-performing organization, a different one than what I studied, don't get out of their desks for 14 hours a day, and they're trying to get them to desperately take breaks. So I think the kind of implications or where these interventions might be more or less effective will differ depending on the organizational environment.
I think you started in the presentation talking about how the employer looks for a signal of commitment and productivity, and that kind of them being on all the time is such a strong signal. And is that addressed combined with your intervention? So, are they being told, take this time off for your deep work, but we also are not going to penalize you for not responding?
Yeah, so part of what these interventions were trying to do is directly address this false urgency that can happen in organizations where people believe that to be as committed and productive as possible, they need to be constantly responsive, which is sometimes antithetical to being the most productive employee on your team, especially in this organization where people are doing a lot of data work and need a lot of deep thinking time. So part of what we were trying to do was create that environment to normalize not responding right away. I just think that maybe it wasn't, it's not strong enough that we needed to do more or actually lock people out of connecting or collaborating. Does that address your?
Yeah, but do you have any measures of whether people are actually worried about it backfiring in exactly that way?
So I do from not this project. So in the qualitative ethnography I alluded to at the beginning, we did have, especially for junior employees and for individuals who might not feel like they fit the traditional mold of the firm, really worry about not being connected constantly to their team. So in one example, in our interview data, we had a junior analyst on a team that during COVID said that to get their exercise break, they would run in 10 minutes, like rotational patterns around, like basically run up and down the same half block over and over again near their apartment because they were so worried they might miss something on Teams. And so we definitely descriptively saw that this fear was overrepresented for more junior employees and also historically less represented groups.
Thank you.